What happens when a quiet black family boards first class, legally, peacefully, and still gets escorted off the plane? What if the man they humiliated turns out to own the entire airline? This isn't just a story about travel. It's about power, perception, and the cost of silence. And it all begins at Gate 27B. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Thurston Ray moved with a calm that didn't quite match the noise around him. Terminal B at Louis Armstrong International buzzed with the usual mix of early morning energy and weary travelers. He adjusted the strap on his canvas duffel bag and reached for his wife's hand. Not because she needed help walking, Elaine could outpace most people, but because it had been a habit for nearly 35 years. Gate 27B, she said, glancing at the screen again. Right, he replied, guiding their two children forward. Lonnie clutched her doll, the fabric worn and familiar, while Micah carried a small backpack with comic books and headphones. They looked every bit the picture of a modest family heading home after a vacation. Nothing about their clothes hinted at extravagance. That was intentional. As they neared the boarding line for Solerajet's premier cabin, the chatter around them quieted just a little. Not enough for someone to notice unless they were used to noticing. Thurston was. It wasn't the first time stairs followed them in spaces like this. Elaine squeezed his hand lightly. He glanced at her. She gave him a soft smile that said, "Keep going. We've earned our seat." The boarding agent scanned their mobile passes without hesitation. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Ray. You and your family are in 1A through 1D. "Thank you," Thurston said, nodding politely. As they walked into the jet bridge, Micah looked up at his father. "Are we really sitting at the front of the plane?" "We are," Thurston said, "right next to the window." Once inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The lighting was dimmed to a gold hue. Quiet instrumental music hummed faintly, and flight attendants glided around offering newspapers and sparkling water. Thurston found their seats. First row, left side. He stood to let Lanny scoot into her window seat while Elaine helped Micah settle beside her. A few other passengers already seated looked up. One man, older, white, in a navy sport coat, furrowed his brow as he watched them. Another woman, somewhere in her 60s, leaned toward a flight attendant and whispered something. The flight attendant glanced up quickly in their direction, then turned and walked toward the front of the cabin. Thurston sat down last. He didn't say anything, but he noticed the glances, the little shifts in posture. It didn't matter what was said out loud. The room had changed. A few minutes later, a new face approached. A woman in her late 40s, sharp haircut, polished smile. Her name tag read, Darla Whitmore, lead flight attendant. "Good morning, sir," she said, standing just close enough to seem concerned but not welcoming. "I'm sorry to trouble you, but may I see your boarding passes again?" Thurston kept his expression even. "Is there a problem?" "It's just a quick verification. We've had some seating misassignments lately." Elaine leaned forward. "You already scanned us at the gate." "I understand," Darla said. "Just want to be sure." Thurston handed her the phone. She glanced at it, nodded slowly, but didn't look quite satisfied. "These are correct," she said, though her voice didn't carry much conviction. "If you'll excuse me." She turned and walked briskly toward the cockpit, where she spoke to another attendant, then tapped something into her device. Thurston didn't say a word. He sat back, looking past the rows of leather seats in front of him, as though he could see the logic unraveling in her head. Elaine leaned close. "She doesn't think we belong up here." "I know." Micah had pulled out his headphones, unaware of the tension. Lanny was watching the window, humming quietly to herself. But Elaine's fingers tensed around the seat arm. She had seen this kind of moment before, in faculty lounges, in school board meetings, in bank lobbies. The tone was always polite, the language vague, but the message never changed. Minutes passed. Then the announcement came. "Attention passengers, we apologize for the delay. We ask that Mr. and Mrs. Ray and family return to the gate. There has been a ticketing issue that must be resolved before departure." Elaine sat still. Thurston stood. He reached for Laney's hand and lifted her gently. "Let's stretch our legs, sweetheart," Micah groaned. "But I just got comfy." "Just a few minutes," Elaine said, her voice soft but steady. As they stepped into the aisle, the older man in the navy jacket avoided eye contact. The woman who had whispered earlier gave a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Wedding ring too large to miss, had raised his voice anyway. She forgot, he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. First class isn't supposed to forget. That was the phrase that stuck. She'd been pulled from duty for 3 days. No investigation, no defense, just suspension. Since then, Darla had made precision her armor. Nothing out of place. No exceptions. She'd learned what to expect from each flight manifest before she stepped on board. Families with young children often brought chaos. Unaccompanied minors required constant monitoring, and passengers who didn't look like they belonged, well, they drew questions. Her job, as she saw it, was to minimize questions. The Ray family had looked too calm, too comfortable, and their presence in seats 1A through 1D had disrupted something she couldn't name but felt with certainty. It wasn't personal, it was protocol. Out in the terminal, Thurston stood near the information counter. He wasn't speaking, just standing with his hands folded loosely behind him, watching as agents answered phones and redirected passengers. Darla spotted him as she passed on her way to the crew room. He didn't approach, didn't wave her over. He simply looked at her. Their eyes met. It was less than a second, maybe even less than that, but it landed hard. Not angry, not accusing, just solid. Like he saw through the polished surface and didn't need to say anything to make his presence known. Darla's steps faltered, just slightly, then resumed. She didn't turn around. Thurston watched her disappear into the hallway, then reached into his pocket. His phone was still open to the secure app. A brief message sat on the screen, already sent an hour ago. Now he tapped a different contact, this one labeled simply, Oversight. Message sent. In the staff lounge, the hum of vending machines filled the quiet. Darla was sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup when the overhead announcement buzzed. Ladies and gentlemen, attention please. Flight 217 to Seattle is currently delayed due to technical review. We apologize for the inconvenience. The voice was calm, standard, but the reaction from passengers in the gate area wasn't. What kind of technical issue? Someone asked. A woman in business attire leaned over to her neighbor. SolaraJet never delays. I've flown them for years. A family with 2 teenagers sighed audibly. One of the teens muttered, "Hope we're not stuck here all night." Back in the lounge, a uniformed man in a dark suit entered. He wasn't crew. His badge marked him as regional operations, someone well above Darla's chain of command. He looked around, then spotted her. "Ms. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I need a word." She nodded, set her coffee down, and followed him into the hallway. No one asked why. Near gate 27B, Micah and Laney were sitting cross-legged on the floor, coloring on sheets of printer paper a kind agent had given them. Lonnie drew clouds and a sun with thick crayon strokes. Micah was more focused. He drew a plane, small windows, engines beneath the wings, and at the very front, a figure sitting above the cockpit window. The figure wore a crown. Elaine glanced over his shoulder. "Who's that, baby?" Micah didn't stop drawing. "That's Dad," he said. "He's not mad, but he's gonna fix the whole plane." Thurston looked at the drawing, his mouth curved into a soft smile. Not a smile of pride, just a quiet one. A reminder. Inside a conference room tucked behind the airport's administration wing, the air felt too still for a space meant to make decisions. 4 members of SolaraJet's senior team sat around a round table, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion and concern. They'd been pulled from their routines with little explanation, just an urgent text from someone higher up than usual. The door opened quietly and a man in a dark blazer stepped in. No badge, no logo on his lapel. Just calm steps and a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. "I'm Bexley," he said, setting the folder on the table. "I represent Mr. Thurston Ray." A pause. "And who is that?" one of the managers asked, half standing in his chair. Bexley remained polite. "Mr. Ray finalized the acquisition of controlling interest in SolaraJet 3 days ago. You'll find the signed agreement and legal confirmations in this folder." He opened it and slid a copy toward each person at the table. They didn't speak for a moment. One woman flipped through the pages, her brow creasing. Another pulled out his phone, presumably to confirm the document's authenticity. The youngest among them, Emery Galt, VP of Operations, looked up first. His face paled a shade. He saw it, the name, and with it, the realization that the same man who had been quietly escorted off Flight 217 just hours ago was the same man who now owned the chair he was sitting in. Emery leaned toward Bexley and spoke in a low voice. "You're telling me the man we removed from first class is the one who owns the whole damn company?" Bexley didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Yes." Emery shook his head slowly. "If this leaks, we'll be the face of every Sunday column in the country, every talk show. You realize that?" "I think what matters more," Bexley said, "is what happens before it leaks." Meanwhile, in the family area near Gate 28, Elaine watched Thurston as he stared out the window. A few rows of planes idled in the distance, their engines humming low. "You don't want to say something?" she asked gently. He didn't turn to her. "Not yet." "They deserve to know who you are," she said. He sighed, almost smiling. "If I tell them now, they'll scramble, issue a statement, apologize, throw someone under the bus." "Isn't that better than staying quiet?" Thurston finally looked at her. "I'm not interested in apologies, Elaine. I want them to feel it, to see it unravel in their own hands before I speak a word." He wasn't angry. If anything, he sounded weary, the kind of tired that came not from a single insult, but from the weight of years, carrying yourself with grace in rooms where your presence felt like a challenge. "I'm not here to break anything," he added, "but I'm not here to let it continue either." Back in the makeshift operations room, Emery rubbed his temples. "Why now?" he muttered to himself. "Why today?" But deep down, he already knew. They had created the exact environment Mr. Ray needed to make his point, and they'd walked right into it. Bexley adjusted his sleeve. "Mr. Ray will give the company a choice soon: reform or explain to the world why they refused to." Just down the hall, Darla sat in a smaller room by herself. Her hands were clasped tightly on her lap, and she stared at the wall in front of her, while someone outside the door printed paperwork. She'd been asked to write a formal statement regarding the events of the morning, what she saw, what protocol she followed. She hadn't been told why, or what the context was, only that it was important. Darla still didn't know who Thurston Ray was. To her, he had been a passenger whose presence unsettled the first-class cabin's atmosphere. She hadn't thought of herself as prejudiced, just protective of a certain standard. That was what she told herself, that she had done her job, that she had followed policy. But deep down, part of her sensed the ground shifting beneath her. Something wasn't right. She wasn't sure her training would cover it. In another part of the terminal, Thurston walked alone. He moved past coffee stands and souvenir shops, through crowds that no longer gave him a second look. His coat flared slightly with each step, one hand in his pocket, the other trailing along the railing of the moving walkway. He paused near a large, sleek ad display. A new Solarajet campaign filled the screen with polished images of smiling couples and business travelers sipping wine mid-air. The tagline scrolled across the bottom in white: Solarajet, luxury designed for those who deserve it. Thurston stared at it for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and snapped a photo. Not for social media, not for the press, just for himself. He spoke quietly under his breath. "What makes someone deserve anything?" His voice barely rose above the hum of the terminal. No one heard him, but the look in his eyes said he was no longer waiting for permission to act. The walls of the hotel suite were quiet, but the silence between Thurston and Elaine was heavier than any storm outside. The kids had long since fallen asleep, tucked into their beds with nightlights glowing softly. Elaine had showered, brushed out Laney's hair, and dimmed the room. But Thurston hadn't moved from his spot by the window. He sat in the corner chair, his dress shirt wrinkled, top button still closed. In his hands, he held the first printed draft of the Solarajet restructuring plan, a document he'd written weeks ago, long before this trip, before this incident, before his ownership had even been finalized. But now holding it didn't feel like progress. It felt like weight. Elaine joined him, still wearing her robe, still smelling faintly of lavender soap. She folded herself into the seat across from him and waited. "I know that look," she said quietly. He didn't look up. You're trying to decide whether to strike or to wait. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and exhaled. I didn't come here to clean house. I came here to build. Sometimes you have to do both. There was a long pause before she spoke again. You're afraid, she said gently. Afraid they'll see you as the angry black man with too much power. Thurston looked up. Her eyes were steady. She wasn't accusing. She was naming the truth he hadn't said aloud. Or worse, she added, that you'll start to believe that's who you've become. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a second. What if I fire her, he said slowly, and it just becomes a headline about revenge? Elaine shook her head. This isn't about her. It's about everyone who thinks like her, who acts like her because the system never questions it. He didn't answer. Thurston, she said softer now, you didn't choose this moment. It chose you. You walk away now. You're telling every future version of you sitting in seat 1A that silence is the safest option. He sat with that, not as a husband, not even as a father, but as a man who had spent his life proving himself over and over, only to find that in the end, someone could still look at him and say, you don't belong here. Meanwhile, a few miles away in a dimly lit cafe near the airport, a young woman sipped her second espresso. Layla Knox didn't usually stay up this late, but when the anonymous email came in, she knew sleep was out of the question. She read it twice, then a third time. Billionaire kicked off his own airline's first class. Video attached. Passengers witnessed it. You'll want this. The sender had no name. The clip was grainy but clear enough. She clicked play. There it was. Thurston Ray standing calmly, ushering his family off the plane. The flight attendant, Darla if she remembered correctly, hovering close behind. There was no yelling, no resistance, just that quiet tension only people who'd been through it could name. Layla had worked PR in aviation for years before launching her own blog. She knew how fast things moved when someone in the industry smelled a scandal. But this wasn't just a miscommunication. This was about image, about power, about a man who looked like half her family being told, even with a ticket in hand, that he didn't fit the mold. She cross-checked public records. Yes, the acquisition was real, quiet, deliberate, just days old. No press release yet, no official change in leadership announced. She stared at her laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She could publish now. She had enough. The headline wrote itself, but she paused. Instead, she scheduled the article to go live at 6:30 the next morning. Then she added one last line to the draft. If Solerajet has anything to say, now's the time. At Solerajet's temporary office near the tarmac, the night shift wasn't quiet. A small group of executives huddled in a side room, phones buzzing with alerts and speculative emails. Emery Galt paced the floor. We need to act before this breaks wide, he said, glancing at the whiteboard filled with bullet points and PR phrases. A balding supervisor leaned forward. We don't even know who leaked it. This could be a setup. It's not, Emery replied. We're caught, and everyone's going to know soon. Another manager shook his head. We can't just fire Darla. That sets a precedent. People are afraid to make decisions if we turn on them the moment there's heat. This wasn't a decision, Emery snapped. It was a judgment, and a wrong one. Someone suggested a neutral statement, a vague apology. Another mentioned offering sensitivity training. Emery's voice cut through the noise. Or we stop pretending this is just a misunderstanding and admit the system needs fixing. The room went quiet. Back in the hotel suite, he walked to the nightstand, placed the restructuring plan down beside the lamp, and turned out the light. Elaine remained seated. You going to sleep? No, he said, grabbing his phone. I need to write something. Not a tweet, not a memo. Something that would speak when the sun came up, if the company didn't speak first. He opened his notes app, but the screen stayed blank for a moment. Then he typed, This isn't about seats. It's about what we see when someone sits in one. He didn't hit send. Yet. At 5:05 in the morning, Emery Galt opened his inbox with a bleary mind and half a cup of stale coffee. Most mornings, emails from the CEO's office were about vendor delays or policy updates. This one was different. The subject line was short and clear. The new owner speaks. He clicked. The message was from Thurston Ray. No attachments, no branding, just plain text. I am the controlling owner of Solarijet. I purchased this airline with the intention of building something that reflects the world we live in, not just the one we've accepted. I'll be making my first public appearance as owner at a press conference this morning at 10 a.m. I encourage you to ensure everyone has a seat, this time literally and otherwise. Emery reread the message twice. Then he stood up so fast the chair behind him rolled into the wall. He didn't need caffeine anymore. He needed time, and that was the one thing he no longer had. Elsewhere, the world was already moving. At a corner of the airport's employee lounge, Darla stirred powdered creamer into her coffee like it was any other morning. The fatigue from the past 24 hours sat heavy on her shoulders, but she kept herself upright like always. Routine was comfort. Routine was safety. Then Angela, the young flight attendant from the day before, approached slowly. She held out her phone like it was something dangerous. "You might want to see this." Darla took it and read the headline on the blog page. "Man removed from first class turns out to be Solarijet's new owner." Her stomach dropped before she even scrolled down. The grainy video clip showed her face, calm, professional, impassive, asking for tickets. The headline didn't need to add judgment. The footage said enough. She handed the phone back, but her hand trembled. "This can't be real," she whispered. But it was. It was everywhere now. She walked out of the lounge like the floor was tilting. Her feet carried her toward the operations office before her mind caught up. She needed to talk to Emery. She needed to understand how bad this really was. Meanwhile, in a hotel suite a few miles away, Thurston stood before a mirror, adjusting the cuffs on his navy blue blazer. Elaine watched him from the bed, her expression calm but steady. He caught her reflection beside his in the mirror. She wore a soft gray dress, and her hair was pulled back neatly. In her ears were the small silver earrings he'd given her on their anniversary 25 years ago. She stood and came to his side. "Today's not about business anymore," she said. "It's about direction." He nodded slowly. "You ready?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I'm clear." They left together, with Micah and Lonnie quietly holding hands as they walked behind them. There was no grand entrance, just a sedan and a short drive to a modest conference room booked by Solarijet's comms team only hours earlier. By the time they arrived, the room was already buzzing. Reporters filled the front rows. Representatives from national travel groups, civil rights organizations, and even a few airport security consultants had shown up. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone had heard. Few knew what to expect. Emery opened the session, standing stiffly behind the podium. "We are grateful you're here," he said, eyes scanning the room but not landing on anyone too long. "Solarijet is committed to transparency and growth, and—" Thurston stood. Without waiting for applause or introduction, he stepped forward and held up a hand. Emery stepped aside, unsure if he'd just been dismissed or saved. Thurston didn't clear his throat or glance at a script. He looked out at the room like he was speaking to a table of old friends. "I'm not here to punish anyone," he began, "but I am here to dismantle something." He let that sit. "For too long, we've measured worthiness by things that say more about our comfort than someone else's character. Clothing, tone of voice, skin color, family makeup." He paused, glancing toward the cameras. "Last week, I bought this airline. Yesterday, this airline removed me and my family from our seats. Not because we were loud or late or a security risk, but because we didn't fit someone's picture of who belongs where." He raised his hand before anyone could speak. "I don't need to name names. This isn't about blame. It's about culture. It's about what we've been taught to expect and what we've learned to excuse." There was a long breath in the room. He then laid out the plan. Clear, steady, direct. A third-party oversight board would be created immediately, composed of employees, passengers, and civil equity experts. All customer-facing staff would go through a 7-day immersive empathy training called simply the passenger view. And those who had once been dismissed, judged, or sidelined would be hired, compensated, and trained to lead those sessions. Some heads turned, some eyes welled, and some looked directly at Darla, who stood near the back, her arms folded tightly across her chest. When the press conference ended, people stood without clapping, almost unsure how to mark what had just happened. This wasn't a victory speech. It was a mirror. Thurston stepped down and walked through the corridor quietly. Darla was leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on the floor. When he passed her, she looked up. Their eyes met. She opened her mouth slightly, but he said nothing. No nod, no scolding, just a pause. A silence that held more meaning than any public rebuke. Then he walked on, and she remained still. The makeshift office smelled faintly of coffee and something sterile, like printed paper and laminate flooring. Sunlight crept in through the blinds, but the air inside was still heavy, like it hadn't caught up with the day yet. Thurston sat alone at the desk. His tie had been loosened, but his jacket was still on. The press conference was over. The crowd had dispersed. But the real work, what mattered, was just beginning. A knock came at the door. One of the younger administrative staff peeked in, hesitating. "Mr. Ray, Miss Darla Whitmore is here. She asked if you'd be willing to speak with her." He didn't pause. "Send her in." The door opened wider. Darla stepped in slowly. She wasn't wearing the navy blazer of her uniform anymore. Her hair, usually clipped tight, was pulled back in a loose ponytail. The sharpness in her eyes from yesterday was gone. She looked like someone still holding on to composure, but barely. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, voice soft. Thurston nodded toward the chair across from him. "Have a seat." She sat carefully. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He gave her the silence, let it settle until she chose to fill it. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I mean, if I'd known who you were, I never would have—" "That," Thurston said quietly, "is exactly the problem." Her lips parted like she was about to explain, but he held up one hand, not angrily, just enough to keep the moment still. "You see, a man, a family, quiet, respectful, following every rule, but none of that was enough until you knew who I was." She looked down. "I'm not here to punish you," he said, "but I need you to understand this isn't just about you. It's about what we allow ourselves to believe without ever saying it out loud." She nodded once, but the shame in her eyes wasn't small. It filled the space between them. "I've been reported before," she said, voice tightening, "for being too rigid, too cold. A few years back, I got suspended after a passenger filed a complaint. He said I ignored him for half the flight. I didn't. I just didn't offer him extra scotch." She smiled bitterly, but it didn't last. "I promised myself I'd follow every rule after that. No exceptions, no distractions, no feelings. I thought, if I kept everything by the book, I couldn't be blamed." Her voice shook on that last word. "I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was trying to keep things orderly, that's all." Thurston leaned back in his chair. "And in doing so, you made a little girl feel like she wasn't allowed to sit beside her father." Darla winced, her body tensing like she'd been struck. "I know," she whispered. "I keep thinking about her face." He didn't push. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a plain envelope. He set it on the table between them and tapped it gently with 2 fingers. "There are 2 options inside," he said. "One is a resignation form, voluntary with a recommendation attached, if you want to leave with some dignity intact." She blinked rapidly, trying not to cry. "And the other?" "The other," Thurston said, "is enrollment paperwork." "Enrollment," she repeated, confused, "for the first group in our new immersion program. We're calling it the Passenger View. 7 days you'll work through the system as a traveler, as someone questioned, overlooked, misjudged." She swallowed. "Why would you give me that?" He didn't smile. "Because I'm not here to tear anyone down, but I can't allow anyone to stand at the gate who doesn't understand the people walking through it." She looked at the envelope, then at him, then back again. Silence stretched. "I don't know if I can do it," she said, voice small. "Not because I don't want to, but because I'm afraid it'll show me just how much I've missed." He didn't flinch. "If you don't try, you'll never know." Darla stood. She picked up the envelope and held it close to her chest, like it might burn her fingers. She turned to leave, but at the doorway, she paused. "You're not what I expected," she said. Thurston didn't look up. "Neither were you." She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded once and walked out, the door clicking gently behind her. In the hallway, Elaine stood leaning against the wall, arms crossed loosely, watching. She didn't say a word as Darla passed. She just offered a small nod. Nothing grand, nothing forgiving, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. Inside, Thurston sat down again. He opened his laptop and looked at a draft email he'd been working on for days. The subject line read, "Next steps." His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then calmly he typed the first line. Real change doesn't start with policy. It starts with the conversation we're most afraid to have. He hit send. No applause, no headlines. Just the sound of a new beginning. A week later, the morning sun filtered softly through the windows of a small training room in Chicago. It wasn't fancy. Folding chairs, a plain whiteboard, a coffee machine sputtering in the corner. But what was happening in that room didn't need chandeliers. On the board, written in thick black marker, were the words, "Training for Empathy. Week 1. Listening without defense." Thurston stepped in quietly, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. No jacket, no fanfare. He didn't come to speak today, just to listen. Darla was seated in the front row, pen in hand, head slightly bowed. She hadn't missed a session. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her voice carried less polish and more presence. At the front of the room, a man named Carlos was recounting his story. Last year, he had been removed from a flight because the gate agent said he was agitated. What had actually happened was his toddler daughter had spilled apple juice on the seat, and he had raised his hand asking for help. The removal had cost him a funeral. He never made it to see his grandmother buried. And the part that hurt most, Carlos said, voice low but clear, was that nobody even looked me in the eye, like I was already the problem before I opened my mouth. Around the room, no one interrupted, no one excused, just pens moving quietly across paper. In the back row, Elaine sat with a small notebook open in front of her, scribbling ideas for a new training guide, the Empathy Handbook. She smiled faintly as Carlos spoke, sadness and pride woven into the same expression. Later that afternoon, the Ray family boarded a flight out of Midway. No gate agent blinked when their names were called. No one asked to double-check their tickets. There was no curtain dividing the rows. Just staggered pricing, but equal space. The new system was clear. Pay more for legroom, pay less for simplicity, but don't expect deference based on your shoes. They sat near the wing. Thurston took the aisle seat. Lanny pressed her nose to the window. A man across the aisle leaned in, squinting. "Excuse me," he said politely. "You're Mr. Ray, right? I saw the interview clip. Powerful stuff. I'd be happy to switch seats so you can sit closer to the front." Thurston smiled. "Appreciate that, but my daughter loves the wing view, so we're just fine back here." The man nodded. "Well, thank you for what you're doing." Thurston nodded once. No big moment, no applause, just acknowledgement. Later, in the crew lounge between layovers, Darla sat on a couch beside a laminated flyer for the new training initiative. She was early for her next shift, but stayed behind after class. When Thurston walked in to check on scheduling logistics, their eyes met. He didn't break the silence. She did. "You know," she said, "when I signed up for this, I thought I was coming to learn about passengers, but I'm learning more about myself than I expected." He leaned on the wall, arms folded. "That's usually how it goes." She exhaled, setting down her pen. "It's strange. The people I once thought I had to manage, they're the ones teaching me how to listen, really listen." He gave her a slight nod. "Listening," he said, "is a kind of leadership. Most people just don't realize it." She smiled, not wide but sincere. There was no need for her to say sorry anymore. Her showing up every day spoke louder. Later that month, Thurston stood behind a podium at a national aviation conference. The room was filled with executives, flight crew, policy advisors, the kind of crowd that once would have only noticed him if he stood out. Now they waited for his words. "I didn't want to become the first man kicked out of his own airline seat," he began. Laughter broke gently, easing the tension. "But I'm glad it happened," he continued, "because I wouldn't have seen the crack otherwise. And the crack wasn't in the plane. It was in the mirror we hold up to each other every day." He looked down, then back up. "We spend a lot of time designing uniforms, menus, and point systems, but we rarely ask what it means to make someone feel welcome without asking for credentials. Dignity shouldn't be a reward for appearance. It should be the default. He paused. I'm not here to say we'll never fail again. I'm saying next time, someone will speak. Because the last time, I did. When the flight home took off that evening, Lanny curled up beside her mother, a blanket tucked under her chin. Mom, she whispered, I don't miss first class. I miss when Dad smiled at the wing. Elaine kissed her forehead. Me too, baby. Thurston looked out in the window. The clouds glowed pink in the soft evening light. He didn't need champagne or a leather seat. He had his family. He had his clarity. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to let it all settle. There was no curtain separating them from anyone else, no line to remind them of where they belonged. He felt like they were flying in the right direction. Sometimes the most powerful change doesn't come from a courtroom or a headline, but from a quiet choice to listen, to speak, or to simply stay in your seat. Thurston Ray didn't raise his voice. He raised a mirror. And maybe that's what we all need now and then. What about you? Have you ever been judged before you had a chance to speak? If this story moved you, don't forget to follow the channel. There's more where that came from.